Brittany Drexel. On the evening of April 25, 2009, 17-year-old Brittany Drexel left the Blue Water Resort in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, captured on surveillance footage wearing a striped tank top and flip-flops. She was heading to visit friends at another hotel, having traveled from Rochester, New York for spring break without her mother's permission. Around 8:45 that night, her text messages to her boyfriend stopped abruptly. Cell tower pings traced her phone moving south along U.S. Route 17 into Georgetown County, where all signals ceased early the following morning. The search for Brittany became one of the most extensive missing persons investigations in South Carolina history. Authorities conducted searches in 2009 and again in 2011, combing through swamps and wooded areas, but found nothing. The case took a disturbing turn in 2016 when inmates provided tips claiming Brittany had been taken to a location where she was harmed and her remains disposed of in an alligator pit. These leads, though ultimately false, generated national attention and the theory that she had become a victim of trafficking. What actually happened was far more straightforward, yet equally tragic. Raymond Moody, a 62-year-old registered offender with previous convictions, encountered Brittany that night and drove her 33 miles to a remote wooded area in Georgetown. There, he ended her life and buried her remains by morning. Moody had a documented history that included prior incidents, making him a dangerous individual who operated in the exact area where Brittany vanished. The investigation struggled for years, despite having crucial evidence. Cell tower data from 2012 linked the area where Brittany's phone went silent to a device registered to Angel Vouse, Moody's girlfriend. However, without concrete proof or a confession, the case remained frustratingly open. Brittany's mother, Dawn Drexel, refused to give up. She relocated to Myrtle Beach permanently, making it her mission to keep pressure on investigators and ensure her daughter's case stayed active. The breakthrough finally came in May 2022. Moody was arrested on an obstruction charge, and during interrogation, he made a full confession. He led authorities directly to where he had buried Brittany's remains in a wooded area near his home. The body was identified through DNA analysis and dental records, bringing closure to a 13-year search that had consumed Dawn's life. The twist that shocked investigators was how close they had been all along. While the nation focused on elaborate trafficking theories, the truth was that a local offender had committed a crime of opportunity. Even more disturbing, Vouse later admitted she had lied to protect Moody throughout the investigation. She told authorities, "I just wanted everybody to leave him alone," a statement that revealed how close relationships can enable the worst crimes. On October 19, 2022, Moody pleaded guilty and received life without parole plus 2 consecutive 30-year terms. At sentencing, he called himself a monster and said, "I don't have the words to express how horrible I feel." Dawn Drexel expressed her rage at seeing him in court. "Once he walked into that courtroom, I was so angry." FBI agent Michael Connolly credited Dawn's relentless pursuit of justice, stating, "There is nobody more singularly responsible for the resolution." In 2025, Vouse was sentenced to 18 years for lying to federal investigators. But one mother's determination was just the beginning. The next case would require technology that didn't exist when the crime occurred. Sophie Sergi. On the morning of April 26, 1993, a student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks made a horrific discovery in Bartlett Hall, a dormitory on campus. In a women's bathroom, they found Sophie Sergi, a 20-year-old Alaska native woman who had been visiting friends. Sophie had traveled from the village of Pitcairn Point and was staying in the dormitory temporarily. She had been found in one of the most public places imaginable, a shared bathroom in a building housing hundreds of students. The crime scene revealed a brazen attack. Sophie had been harmed in multiple ways, and investigators found clear evidence of what had occurred. The bathroom was located on the second floor of Bartlett Hall, making the crime even more audacious given the number of potential witnesses nearby. The attack appeared random, with no indication that Sophie knew her attacker or had been specifically targeted. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The investigation immediately focused on the dormitory's residents and visitors. Hundreds of students were questioned, and DNA evidence was collected from the scene. But forensic technology in the early 90s was limited. The DNA profile didn't match anyone in law enforcement databases, and without a suspect, the case grew cold. For 25 years, Sophie's family waited for answers while investigators kept the evidence preserved, hoping technology would eventually catch up. The case remained dormant until 2018, when investigators decided to employ a revolutionary technique: genetic genealogy. This method uses public DNA databases to identify potential relatives of unknown suspects, then works backward through family trees. Authorities uploaded the crime scene DNA to public genealogy websites, a practice that was just beginning to solve cold cases across America. The genetic genealogy search produced a stunning hit. The DNA matched a family connection to Stephen Downs, a man who had been a student at UAF in 1993. Downs had lived in Maine for years following his time in Alaska, working ordinary jobs and living what appeared to be a normal life. He had no significant criminal history beyond a minor offense, nothing that would have placed him on investigators' radar. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Downs initially denied any knowledge of Sophie or the crime. However, the genetic evidence was irrefutable. The DNA collected from Sophie's body and the crime scene was compared directly to Downs' DNA, and the match was definitive. Investigators pieced together that Downs had likely been in Bartlett Hall that night and encountered Sophie by chance in the bathroom. What made this case particularly significant was the breakthrough it represented for genetic genealogy. The technique had been used successfully in the Golden State Killer case. But Sophie's case was among the early successes that proved the method's viability for other cold cases. The connection came through a relative who had voluntarily uploaded their DNA to a genealogy website, never imagining it would help solve a decades-old case. In February 2022, a jury found Downs guilty of first-degree felony assault and second-degree homicide. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence along with testimony about Downs' presence in Bartlett Hall during the relevant time period. In September 2022, he was sentenced to 75 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Downs filed an appeal in 2025, challenging the use of genetic genealogy evidence and questioning whether the DNA search violated privacy rights. The case has become a landmark for legal questions surrounding this investigative technique. Meanwhile, Sophie's family finally received answers after more than 2 decades of waiting, though the randomness of the crime offered little comfort. From a university dormitory, we moved to a quiet apartment where another life was stolen. Rita Curran. On the night of July 19, 1971, 24-year-old Rita Curran was in her second-floor apartment on North Prospect Street in Burlington, Vermont. Rita was a school teacher who had recently moved to the area, sharing the apartment with a roommate who was out that evening. Rita had spent the night at home, and neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual from the quiet residential building. By the following morning, Rita was found deceased in her apartment. The scene suggested a targeted attack. Rita had been harmed in multiple ways, and the apartment showed signs of an encounter. There was no evidence of forced entry, leading investigators to theorize that Rita either knew her attacker or had opened the door to someone who seemed unthreatening. The brutality of the crime shocked the small Vermont community, where such incidents were rare. The investigation in 1971 followed traditional methods of the era. Police interviewed neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have had contact with Rita in the days before her passing. One neighbor, William DeRoos, was questioned but provided an alibi. His wife confirmed his whereabouts, and investigators had no physical evidence to contradict his story. The case went cold, joining countless other unsolved homicides from that era. DeRoos lived in the same building as Rita, occupying an apartment that gave him easy access to her floor. He had a criminal history that included previous incidents, but without concrete evidence linking him to Rita's case, he remained free. In 1986, DeRoos passed away in Thailand, seemingly taking any secrets about Rita's case with him. The case remained dormant for more than 50 years. Rita's family never stopped hoping for resolution. But as decades passed, the likelihood of solving the case seemed increasingly remote. Then, in the early 2000s, advances in DNA technology offered new possibilities for cold cases. Burlington police decided to re-examine evidence from Rita's case using modern forensic techniques. The critical piece of evidence was a cigarette butt found at the crime scene. In 1971, it had been collected and preserved but couldn't be meaningfully analyzed with the technology available at the time. Decades later, DNA extraction methods had improved dramatically, allowing scientists to recover genetic material from old, degraded evidence. Using genetic genealogy techniques similar to those employed in Sophie Sergi's case, investigators built a family tree from the DNA on the cigarette butt. The trail led directly to William DeRoos. The man who had been Rita's neighbor, who had been questioned and cleared in 1971, was actually her attacker. The revelation brought a stunning twist to light. DeRoos' wife, who had provided his alibi decades earlier, later recanted her story. She admitted that she had lied to protect her husband, though her motivations for initially covering for him and later telling the truth remain partially unclear. This recantation, combined with the DNA evidence, painted a clear picture of what had happened that July night. In February 2023, Burlington police officially announced that William DeRoos had been identified as Rita's killer. Because DeRoos had been deceased since 1986, no trial would ever take place, and he would face no legal consequences for his actions. However, for Rita's family and the Burlington community, the identification brought closure to a 52-year-old mystery. While a neighbor proved to be the perpetrator in Rita's case, the next investigation would uncover an even closer connection. Mandy Stavik. On Thanksgiving weekend in 1989, 18-year-old Mandy Stavik went for an afternoon jog near her home in Whatcom County, Washington. Mandy was home from college, visiting her family for the holiday. She left her house around 2:30 in the afternoon, running along the rural roads she had known her entire life. When darkness fell and Mandy hadn't returned, her family immediately knew something was wrong. The search began that evening and intensified over the following days. On November 27th, 3 days after she disappeared, Mandy's body was discovered in the Nooksack River. She had been found partially submerged in the cold water, and the medical examiner determined she had drowned. However, evidence made it clear that drowning was not accidental. Mandy had been harmed before being placed in the river. The investigation immediately gathered momentum. DNA evidence was collected from Mandy's body, a relatively new forensic tool in 1989. The DNA profile was preserved, but it didn't match anyone in the small community of Acme, Washington. Police interviewed hundreds of people, including many of Mandy's classmates and neighbors. The case generated intense local attention, with residents struggling to understand who could have committed such a crime in their quiet community. One name that came up during interviews was Timothy Bass. Bass was a local man who had gone to high school in the area, though he was several years older than Mandy. He worked at a bakery in Whatcom County and lived a seemingly ordinary life. There was no obvious connection between Bass and Mandy, and without physical evidence linking him to the crime, the investigation stalled. For nearly 3 decades, the case remained unsolved. Mandy's family and the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office never abandoned hope. But leads dried up as years passed. Then, in 2013, 2 mothers having a casual conversation at a water park inadvertently broke the case open. The mothers, who both had connections to the Acme community, began discussing Mandy's unsolved homicide. One mentioned that her husband worked with Timothy Bass and that Bass had made strange comments about the case over the years. The other mother recalled hearing similar stories about Bass displaying unusual interest in Mandy's case. These conversations eventually reached law enforcement, prompting investigators to take a fresh look at Bass. The challenge was obtaining Bass's DNA without alerting him to the investigation. In 2017, detectives devised a plan. They followed Bass to a local restaurant and waited for him to leave. After Bass departed, investigators retrieved a Coca-Cola can he had been drinking from and discarded. The can was sent to the crime lab for analysis. The DNA from the Coke can matched the DNA collected from Mandy's body in 1989. After 28 years, investigators finally had their suspect. Bass was arrested in December 2017 and charged with first-degree felony assault and homicide. During the investigation, Bass made claims that he and Mandy had been in a relationship, suggesting the encounter was consensual. However, there was absolutely no evidence supporting this assertion. Mandy's family, friends, and classmates all confirmed that she had never mentioned knowing Bass beyond possibly seeing him around the small community. The DNA evidence told a clear story of what had actually occurred. The trial hinged on the DNA evidence and testimony from community members. In May 2019, a jury found Timothy Bass guilty. He was sentenced to nearly 27 years in prison. At sentencing, Mandy's mother addressed Bass directly, expressing both her grief and her relief that justice had finally been served. The case gained additional significance because of how it was solved. The water park conversation between 2 mothers demonstrated how community vigilance and willingness to report suspicion can crack even the coldest cases. The use of discarded DNA from the Coke can also become a teaching moment for law enforcement agencies, showing how investigators could obtain DNA samples without direct confrontation when probable cause existed. Timothy Bass had lived in the community for nearly 3 decades after ending Mandy's life, working at the bakery and maintaining an outwardly normal existence. Nobody suspected that the quiet bakery worker had committed one of Whatcom County's most notorious crimes. Sometimes the person responsible lived nearby for years. Other times, they died before justice could catch up. Sharon Prior. On the evening of March 29, 1975, 16-year-old Sharon Prior left her home in the Pointe-Saint-Charles neighborhood of Montreal, Quebec. She told her mother she was going to meet friends at a pizzeria, a short walk from their house. Sharon left around 7:30 in the evening, and her mother expected her home within a few hours. The pizzeria was a popular spot for teenagers in the neighborhood, and the walk there was one Sharon had made countless times. Sharon never arrived at the pizzeria. At approximately 10:30 that evening, witnesses reported seeing a young woman matching Sharon's description getting into a vehicle near her route. The witnesses couldn't provide details about the driver or even confirm it was definitely Sharon. But the timing and location were consistent with her disappearance. This sighting became one of the few leads investigators had to work with. On April 1st, Sharon's body was discovered in a wooded area near Longueuil, across the river from Montreal. She had been found in a state that indicated extreme mistreatment. The medical examiner determined she had been harmed in multiple ways before being left in the woods. The location was remote, suggesting the perpetrator had local knowledge and deliberately chose an isolated spot. The investigation became one of Quebec's most intensive cold case efforts. Police interviewed hundreds of people and followed numerous leads throughout the 1970s and 80s. Sharon's family, particularly her mother Doreen Prior, became tireless advocates for keeping the case active. Doreen appeared in media regularly, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Physical evidence from the crime scene was carefully preserved, though the forensic technology of the 70s was limited. Decades passed with no breakthrough. The case haunted Montreal, representing both the dangers young people faced and the limitations of investigative techniques in that era. Sharon's family aged while waiting for answers, with Doreen maintaining hope even as the case seemed increasingly unlikely to be solved. The turning point came in the 2000s when Quebec police decided to re-examine old evidence using modern DNA technology. Genetic material had been collected from Sharon's clothing, and advances in DNA extraction allowed scientists to develop a profile. Using genetic genealogy, investigators began building family trees to identify potential matches. The DNA trail led to Franklin Romine, a man who had passed away in 1982 in West Virginia. Romine had a criminal history that included previous incidents, and records showed he had been in the Montreal area in March 1975. He had family connections to Quebec, giving him reason to be in the region during the time of Sharon's disappearance. However, Romine's death 43 years before his identification as a suspect created unique challenges. To definitively confirm the DNA match, investigators needed to exhume his body from a cemetery in West Virginia, more than 1,000 miles from Montreal. This process required extensive legal coordination between Canadian and American authorities and approval from Romine's surviving family members. In May 2023, police officially announced that Franklin Romine had been identified as Sharon's killer. The exhumation had confirmed the DNA match, providing definitive proof that Romine was responsible for the crime that had haunted Montreal for 48 years. Because Romine had died decades earlier, no prosecution was possible. But the identification gave Sharon's family the answers they had desperately sought. For Doreen Prior, who had campaigned for nearly 5 decades to solve her daughter's case, the announcement brought bittersweet relief. She had waited most of her life for answers, watching as other cold cases were solved while Sharon's remained open. The identification of Romine meant that Sharon's case was no longer a mystery. Though it couldn't undo the years of uncertainty or bring criminal consequences for the perpetrator. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. These cases revealed killers close to home. But the next story took an unexpected turn when the truth came from the killer himself. Zoe Campos. On January 8, 2013, 16-year-old Zoe Campos vanished from Lubbock, Texas. She had last been seen in the company of Carlos Rodriguez, a 20-year-old man she knew from the neighborhood. When Zoe failed to return home that evening, her family immediately contacted authorities, and a missing persons investigation began. The disappearance sent shockwaves through Lubbock, with searches organized across the city and surrounding areas. Rodriguez became a person of interest early in the investigation. Witnesses had seen Zoe with him on the day she disappeared, and his behavior in the following days raised suspicions. Police questioned him multiple times, but without physical evidence or a body, they couldn't make an arrest. Rodriguez maintained that Zoe had left his presence alive and that he had no knowledge of her whereabouts. The case remained active but unsolved for 5 years. Zoe's family conducted their own searches and kept media attention on her disappearance, refusing to let her case fade from public consciousness. They distributed flyers, organized vigils, and pressured law enforcement to continue investigating. The lack of answers haunted them, as they struggled between hope that Zoe might still be alive and the growing fear that she had met with harm. In 2018, investigators received new information that led them back to Rodriguez. They obtained a search warrant for a property associated with him and began excavating the backyard. As authorities began digging, Rodriguez made a stunning decision that would finally bring closure to the case. Rodriguez confessed to ending Zoe's life and told investigators exactly where to find her remains in his backyard. According to his statement, he and Zoe had been together when they consumed substances, and Rodriguez claimed he experienced a hallucination that caused him to harm her. After realizing what he had done, he buried her body in the yard and maintained his denial for 5 years. The confession revealed that Zoe had been just feet from where investigators had previously searched. Her remains were recovered from the backyard burial site, finally giving her family the ability to lay her to rest properly. The 5-year delay meant that forensic evidence was limited, but Rodriguez's confession provided details about what had occurred on that January day in 2013. The twist in Zoe's case was the voluntary nature of the confession. Unlike many cold cases that require years of forensic work or technological breakthroughs, this one was solved because the perpetrator chose to reveal the truth when confronted with the excavation. Whether motivated by guilt, the inevitability of discovery, or other factors, Rodriguez's decision to confess ended years of uncertainty for Zoe's family. In August 2022, Rodriguez was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The sentencing hearing was emotional, with Zoe's family members delivering impact statements about how her disappearance and the subsequent years of not knowing had devastated them. They expressed relief that Rodriguez would spend decades behind bars, though no sentence could truly compensate for the loss of Zoe or the years spent searching for answers. From a backyard burial to a confession booth, the next case would involve a man in a position of sacred trust. Irene Garza. On the evening of April 16, 1960, 26-year-old Irene Garza went to Sacred Heart Catholic Church in McAllen, Texas. Irene was a former beauty queen and schoolteacher who was deeply religious. She had arranged to attend confession that evening with Father John Feit, a 27-year-old priest who was serving at the church. Irene arrived around 7 in the evening and entered the church for what she expected to be a routine sacrament. When Irene didn't return home that night, her family grew concerned. They contacted the church and learned she had indeed arrived for confession. Father Feit confirmed seeing Irene but claimed she had left after their conversation. A search began, focusing on the area around the church and Irene's usual routes. The community mobilized, with volunteers combing through McAllen looking for any sign of the missing woman. 5 days after her disappearance, Irene's body was discovered in a canal near the church. The medical examiner determined she had been harmed in multiple ways and had died from oxygen deprivation. Evidence suggested she had been kept somewhere for a period before being placed in the canal. The discovery devastated McAllen, and suspicion immediately fell on those who had last seen Irene alive. Father Feit became the focus of the investigation. Investigators discovered scratches on his hands, and items belonging to Irene were found at the church. However, the Catholic Church hierarchy moved quickly to protect Feit. He was transferred out of McAllen to a monastery, and church officials discouraged investigators from pursuing him aggressively. Without physical evidence, technology like DNA testing, and facing institutional resistance, the case stalled. The investigation revealed troubling patterns in Feit's history. Just weeks before Irene's passing, another young woman had been harmed at a church where Feit served. That victim survived and identified Feit, leading to charges, but he received only a minor sentence. This prior incident should have made him a stronger suspect in Irene's case. But the church's influence created barriers to prosecution. For decades, the case remained officially unsolved. Feit left the priesthood, married, and lived in Arizona, working in ordinary jobs and appearing to be a normal retiree. Meanwhile, Irene's family and the McAllen community never forgot. A key breakthrough came from monks at the monastery where Feit had been sent in 1960. They revealed that Feit had confessed to them about harming Irene, providing crucial testimony that had been suppressed for years. This testimony, combined with renewed investigative efforts in the 2000s, led to Feit's arrest. In February 2016, at age 83, he was finally charged with Irene's ending. The trial, held in late 2017, was remarkable for occurring 57 years after the crime. Prosecutors presented evidence about the church's cover-up, testimony from the monks about Feit's confession, and forensic analysis of the original evidence. The jury found Feit guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. The conviction came as a vindication for those who had suspected Feit for decades and had fought against institutional resistance to see justice served. However, Feit's advanced age meant his time in prison would be limited. He passed away in February 2020 while still incarcerated, serving less than 3 years of his life sentence. While one case involved institutional protection, the next would span international borders and 2 connected lives lost. Tanya van Quedlinburg. In November 1987, 18-year-old Tanya van Quedlinburg and her boyfriend, 20-year-old Jay Cook, left their home in Saanich, British Columbia, for what should have been a quick trip to Seattle. The couple planned to pick up furnace parts for Jay's family business and return the same day. They drove Jay's bronze-colored Ford van, expecting to be home by evening. When they failed to return, their families immediately knew something had gone terribly wrong. The first grim discovery came on November 24th. Tanya's body was found near Alger, Washington, about 70 miles south of the Canadian border. She had been located in a rural area, and evidence indicated she had been harmed before being left there. The location was remote, suggesting the perpetrator had knowledge of the area and deliberately chose an isolated spot. The following day, investigators found Jay's van abandoned in a parking area in Bellingham, Washington. This discovery prompted an intensive search of the surrounding region. On November 26th, Jay's body was discovered under the Whatcom County High Bridge. He had been found in a different location from Tanya, indicating the couple had been separated at some point during their ordeal. The investigation became a joint effort between American and Canadian authorities. DNA evidence was collected from both crime scenes, but in 1987, genetic analysis was in its infancy. The DNA profiles were preserved, but yielded no matches in law enforcement databases. Hundreds of tips came in over the years, and investigators pursued numerous leads, but the case remained unsolved for 3 decades. The breakthrough came in 2018 through genetic genealogy, the same technique that had solved Sophie Sergi's case. Investigators uploaded the crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases, searching for family connections. The search identified potential relatives, and through painstaking genealogical research, investigators built a family tree that led to William Earl Talbot II. Talbot was a Washington state resident with no prior criminal record that would have placed him in databases. He had lived in the area where Jay and Tanya were found, giving him local knowledge of the remote locations. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Talbot maintained his innocence, but the genetic match was definitive. Investigators theorized that he had encountered the couple during their trip to Seattle, though the exact circumstances of how they crossed paths remained unclear. The trial in 2019 presented the DNA evidence alongside testimony about Talbot's presence in the area during November 1987. Family members testified about Talbot's history, with some describing violent tendencies from his youth. The prosecution argued that Talbot had randomly targeted the young couple, separating them and harming each in different locations. Talbot was convicted and sentenced to 2 life terms, bringing closure to families who had waited 31 years for answers. However, the legal saga didn't end there. In December 2021, a Washington state appeals court overturned Talbot's conviction, ruling that the genetic genealogy evidence had been improperly admitted. The court found that investigators should have obtained a warrant before uploading the DNA to genealogy databases. The overturn created legal precedent about the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. It raised questions about privacy rights and the Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches. The case became a landmark for future prosecutions using this technology. The status of potential retrial remained unclear, leaving both families and investigators in limbo about whether Talbot would face justice again. 2 lives were taken that November, their families united in grief across the border. The next case would also involve a park, but the victim would be much younger. Michella Welch. On March 26, 1986, 12-year-old Michella Welch went to Puget Park in Tacoma, Washington, with her 2 younger sisters. Michella was responsible for watching her sisters while they played. Around noon, she rode her bicycle home to get lunch for the 3 of them, leaving her sisters at the park with the promise to return quickly. Michella made it home, prepared sandwiches, and headed back to Puget Park. When Michella returned to the park, her sisters were still playing where she had left them. Michella told them she was going to a nearby restroom and would be right back. When she didn't return after a considerable time, the sisters went looking for her. They searched the park and surrounding areas but couldn't find their older sister. Growing frightened, they went home and told their family that Michella was missing. A massive search began immediately. That evening, Michella's body was discovered in a wooded area of Puget Park, hidden in dense brush. The medical examiner determined she had been harmed in multiple ways. The proximity of the crime to where her sisters were playing and the public nature of the park shocked investigators. Someone had committed this act in broad daylight in a place filled with families. The investigation collected DNA evidence from the scene, advanced technology for 1986. The DNA profile was preserved, but produced no matches in criminal databases. Police interviewed park visitors, neighbors, and anyone who might have been in the area that day. The case generated enormous attention in Tacoma, with parents suddenly fearful about letting their offspring play in public parks. Tragically, just 5 months after Michella's case, another young girl was taken and ended in Tacoma's Point Defiance Park. The similarities between the 2 cases led investigators to suspect they might be connected. This theory would persist for decades, with many believing the same perpetrator was responsible for both crimes. For 32 years, Michella's case remained unsolved despite the preserved DNA evidence. Then, in 2018, investigators decided to use a new surveillance technique. They began monitoring Gary Hartman, a nurse practitioner who lived in the Tacoma area, after genetic genealogy had identified him as a potential suspect. Detectives followed Hartman to a restaurant and retrieved a napkin he had used and discarded. The DNA from the napkin matched the DNA from Michella's case. Hartman was arrested in June 2018 and charged with first-degree homicide. During the investigation, authorities determined that Hartman had no connection to the other Tacoma case from 1986. The two crimes that had seemed so similar were actually committed by different perpetrators, a revelation that shocked the community and investigators alike. Hartman's trial presented the DNA evidence and testimony about his presence in Tacoma during March 1986. The prosecution argued that Hartman had been at Puget Park that day and had encountered Michella when she was alone. The defense couldn't overcome the DNA evidence, which definitively placed Hartman at the crime scene. In March 2022, Hartman was sentenced to 26 years and 6 months in prison. The sentencing hearing was emotional, with Michella's family members describing how her loss had affected them for 36 years. They spoke about the little girl who never got to grow up, who never experienced high school, graduation, or adulthood. The delayed justice meant that Michella's parents had spent most of their lives waiting for resolution. From a Tacoma park to a California campus, the final case would take the longest to solve and would become one of the most watched cold cases in American history. Kristin Smart. On May 25, 1996, 19-year-old Kristin Smart attended an off-campus party near California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. Kristin was a freshman at Cal Poly, adjusting to college life and making friends. The party was a typical college gathering, and Kristin seemed to be enjoying herself throughout the evening. As the party wound down in the early hours of May 26th, Kristin began walking back toward her dormitory. Two other students, Cheryl Anderson and Paul Flores, encountered Kristin on the walk back. Kristin appeared to be affected by consumption and was having difficulty walking. Anderson and Flores helped her, with the three walking together toward the campus dormitories. At a certain point, Anderson separated from the group to head to her own residence, leaving Flores alone with Kristin. Kristin was never seen again after that moment. When Kristin didn't show up for classes or contact her family over the Memorial Day weekend, her parents immediately knew something was wrong. They reported her missing on May 28th, beginning what would become one of California's most enduring missing persons cases. Campus police initially treated it as a runaway situation, a delay that potentially compromised early investigative opportunities. Paul Flores immediately became a person of interest. He was the last known person to see Kristin alive, and his behavior following her disappearance raised suspicions. Flores gave conflicting accounts of what happened after Anderson left them, and he had fresh injuries, including a black eye, that he couldn't adequately explain. However, without physical evidence or a body, authorities couldn't make an arrest. The investigation expanded to include searches of the Cal Poly campus and surrounding areas. Cadaver dogs showed interest in areas near Flores' dormitory room, but searches yielded no remains. The case attracted national media attention, with Kristin's family appearing regularly on television to plead for information. They hired private investigators and pursued their own leads, refusing to accept that Kristin might never be found. Over the following decades, investigators pursued numerous theories and leads. Multiple women came forward with allegations about Flores' behavior, describing unwanted advances and concerning conduct. These accounts painted a picture of someone who had a history of problematic interactions with women. But none of this information was enough to charge him with Kristin's disappearance. The case took dramatic turns as investigators focused increasingly on the Flores family property. Paul's father, Ruben Flores, became a subject of scrutiny based on suspicions that he may have helped his son. In 2020, authorities obtained warrants to search the Flores properties again, this time using ground-penetrating radar and other advanced technology. The searches uncovered evidence under a deck at Ruben, Flores' home, including soil with human blood. This discovery, combined with 25 years of circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, led to arrests in April 2021. Paul Flores was charged with ending Kristin's life, while Ruben Flores was charged as an accessory for allegedly helping hide her remains. The trial, held in 2022, was split with separate juries for father and son. The prosecution argued that Paul had harmed Kristin during an attempted advance on the night she disappeared, then sought his father's help in concealing what happened. The defense maintained Paul's innocence and argued that the lack of a body meant reasonable doubt existed. Ruben's defense argued that any help he provided was unknowing. In October 2022, Paul Flores was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Ruben Flores was acquitted of the accessory charge, with the jury finding insufficient evidence that he knowingly helped conceal remains. The conviction of Paul brought a measure of closure to the Smart family after 26 years, though Kristin's body has never been recovered. Paul Flores filed an appeal in October 2024, seeking to overturn his conviction, arguing that certain evidence was improperly admitted. The appeal remains pending, adding another chapter to a case that has spanned nearly 3 decades. For Kristin's family, the conviction represented justice long delayed, though the absence of remains means some questions will never be fully answered. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.